Some empires arrive in history like storms, loud enough to frighten the whole horizon, and then they pass so completely that even their names begin to feel like dust. Persia is not like that. Persia seems to move by another law, slower, deeper, harder to erase. It rises under one name, then under another. It gathers power, loses it, gathers itself again. Armies cross its plains. Kings burn its palaces. Foreign faiths settle over old shrines. And yet something beneath the surface remains awake, waiting, remembering, returning. That is why tonight we are not following only a chain of rulers or a march of battles. We are following a mystery. How can one land be broken so many times and still remain itself? How can one civilization bend through conquest after conquest without ever vanishing entirely into the people that conquered it? There are places in the world that become more than countries. They become habits of history. Persia, in the long quiet of the centuries, became one of those places. To Rome it was a rival. To Greece it was a threat, an equal, and sometimes an obsession. To merchants it was a crossroads. To pilgrims, scholars, and exiles it was a bridge between worlds. And to its own people, across ages of changing borders and changing faith, it was something even more intimate than empire. It was a centre of gravity, a place that kept drawing memory back toward itself. So rather than hurrying toward famous names, let us begin with a gentler thought. Imagine a land that has learned, over thousands of years, that survival does not always look dramatic. Sometimes survival looks like a road that is repaired again, a language that lingers in administration after dynasties fall, a garden watered in a dry country, a prayer spoken beside a flame, a city rebuilt where older walls once stood. Persia endured not only through force, but through repetition, patience, and the strange durability of form. And that may be the truest reason its story still glows. Persia did not survive because nothing happened to it. Persia survived because everything happened to it, and still it remained. Before we move into dynasties and capitals and all the grand words that history likes to use, let the noise recede for a moment. Let the map grow dim. Let the centuries loosen their grip. Imagine instead the Iranian plateau at night, long before the names most of us know had settled over it. The air is dry and cool after the heat of the day. The mountains stand in dark folds against a sky heavy with stars. Far below, valleys hold patches of cultivation like quiet promises. Somewhere, water moves underground, invisible and patient. Somewhere, a small fire burns beside stone, and its light hardly reaches beyond the people gathered near it. There is a certain calm in landscapes that are not easy. Easy land invites carelessness. Difficult land teaches rhythm. It teaches people where to rest, where to store, how to travel, how to wait. The plateau that would one day be called Persia was not generous in the effortless way of a broad river plain. It asked more of the people who lived upon it. It required memory. It required observation. It rewarded those who could live between scarcity and distance without losing their softness toward life. To the west lay the great lowlands of Mesopotamia, where rivers could be disciplined and fields could stretch outward in rich obedience. To the east and north, routes led towards Central Asia, towards steppes and mountain corridors and worlds of movement. In between stood this harder country, uplifted and varied, half open, half defended, never fully isolated and never entirely exposed. It was a place that invited passage and resistance at the same time. This matters because geography is not only scenery in history, it is pressure, it is mood, it is instruction, the great dry spaces, the folded highlands, the narrow fertile belts, the edges of desert, the cold winters in some regions and the punishing summers in others. All of these shaped the habits of those who lived there. Later, when empires rose, those empires would inherit more than territory. They would inherit the temperament of the land itself. So tonight, before we listen to kings, let us listen to Wind over Stone. Let us look up into that immense dark sky and feel how old the stillness is. Long before Persia became an empire, it was already a stage set for endurance. If you stay with this story for long enough, a reassuring pattern begins to appear. Names change, capitals move, dynasties flare brightly and then fail. New peoples arrive from the steppe, from the west, from the south. Faiths replace other faiths, and sometimes absorb them. Languages rise in prestige, then settle into memory. Yet beneath those shifts, the structure remains readable. A centre forms around the Iranian heartland. That centre reaches westward toward Mesopotamia and Anatolia, eastward towards Central Asia and India. It grows strong through trade, administration, and adaptation. It weakens under strain or bad rule. It is struck from outside. It fractures then, after a time, the centre gathers again. That is the story we are really telling, not a list of monarchs, but the repeated making and remaking of Persian space. This should make the long journey ahead feel lighter. We do not need to hold every date too tightly. We do not need to memorize every succession. We are simply watching an old pattern unfold at different speeds. Once you see it, the whole history becomes less crowded and more musical. And there is another comfort in this approach. Persia is often introduced through conflict, as if its destiny were only to threaten Greece, face Rome, or stand in tense relation to modern powers. But that view is too narrow and too noisy for the deeper truth. Persia was also irrigation, poetry, bureaucracy, gardens, roads, storage, exchange, and belief. It was as much about making life possible in a difficult landscape as about ruling a wide empire. It was as much about continuity as conquest. So let us make a quiet agreement before we go further. We will not chase the sharpest moments at the expense of the softer ones. When battles appear, we will pass through them carefully. When rulers rise, we will ask what structure they left behind. When the story grows tense, we will return to safer ground. To water, to roads, to households, to faith, to the patient habits that outlast victory. With that settled, we can go back much farther than empire, to a time before Persia had fully become itself, when villages, mountains, and early cities were laying down the deepest layers of the story. The story begins in such deep time that the later word Persia would have meant nothing there. In the western reaches of the plateau, near the Zagros mountains, people were already settling, sowing, storing, fermenting, and learning the seasons thousands of years before the classical age. These early communities do not announce themselves with imperial grandeur. They arrive quietly, in seeds, in vessels, in traces of grain and habit. But their silence should not fool us. They were preparing a civilizational field. Imagine the earliest villagers living where mountain slopes soften into valleys, where cultivated patches can survive if watched carefully, where animals are kept, where grain is measured, where the year is understood through repeated labour rather than abstract calendars. Their world was intimate and physical. Hands in soil, clay shaped and fired, food dried and stored, paths remembered, tools passed along. The great changes of history are often built on these almost invisible routines. The western lands of what is now Iran were never sealed off from the lowland civilizations to their west. Contact with Mesopotamia came early and often. Goods moved, ideas moved, techniques moved. The border between worlds was not empty. It was active, porous, and full of opportunity. The people of the plateau were not waiting in isolation for civilization to arrive from elsewhere. They were already participating in a broad zone of invention and adaptation. And yet, they were doing so on their own terms. Life in higher, rougher country does not produce the same habits as life in broad, heavily irrigated plains. The environment encouraged smaller pockets of settlement, mixed economies, pastoral movement, and a practical toughness that later observers would often attribute to the peoples of the Iranian world. There was less softness in the land, perhaps, but also less dependence on a single kind of order. If you picture this early world carefully, you can already sense one of the reasons Persia would later prove so durable. A civilization that grows only out of one capital or one river can be shattered when that center is shattered. A civilization that grows from many valleys, many roots, many communities linked by exchange and memory is harder to erase. The roots are distributed, the habits are local before they are imperial. So before Persia had kings of world renown, before roads stretched from capital to capital, before royal inscriptions told the story in stone, there was this quieter beginning. Villages beneath mountains, cultivated ground in difficult country, and a people learning that continuity is something made by daily repetition. From that old foundation, one of the earliest great political centers of the region would emerge. That early center was Elam, and within Elam, the city of Susa would become one of the oldest enduring points of gravity in the whole Near East. Susa does not belong only to one age. That is part of its magic. It seems to stand with one foot in prehistory and another in imperial history, receiving wave after wave of change, while preserving its centrality. Long before later, Persian rulers used it as an administrative heart. Susa was already alive with exchange, authority, and sacred presence. Elam itself was not a simple nation in the modern sense, and trying to imagine it that way makes it harder to understand. It was more likely a coalition world, a landscape of linked peoples, hill communities, and centers of power bound by geography, trade, and ritual. To the lowland powers of Mesopotamia, these were the peoples of the high country, the mountain realm beyond the easy logic of river control. That distinction between the people of the plain and the people of the heights would echo again and again in Persian history. There is something very old in the idea of the mountain memory. The mountains do not produce abundance in the same effortless way as river plains, but they produce resilience. They produce communities used to limited land, seasonal movement, and defensive awareness. They produce people who know routes, passes, and shelter. In a broad historical sense, the Iranian world inherited this texture. It was never only urban and never only pastoral. It lived between those conditions. Elam also seems to have carried cultural traits that feel quietly important when seen from later Persian history. Its religion appears to have been open, layered, and tolerant in a way that allowed neighboring beliefs to be absorbed rather than simply rejected. Nature, elevated places, sacred groves, and divine powers bound to the world itself mattered deeply. Women seem to have held a more respected place in representation and status than in many surrounding societies. Animals appeared prominently in art, and rulership itself may have been imagined in forms less rigid than those of some neighboring lowland powers. Even where certainty is impossible, the impression remains of a culture whose tone was distinct. Susa sat at the meeting point of worlds. It was never only a mountain town and never merely a frontier station. It linked highland resources with lowland demand. It participated in networks that reached eastward as well as westward. It knew the pressure of invasion, but it also knew the benefits of being necessary. That too would become a Persian pattern. The same roots that bring danger bring wealth. The same openness that invites conquest invites exchange. So, in Elam and in Susa, we begin to see the first mature outline of a recurring Persian truth. Power here was not accidental. It grew from geography, from exchange, from the ability to survive pressure without losing shape. The city could be threatened, the coalition could be weakened, but the mountain memory endured, and the old centre remained ready for later ages to inherit. As centuries passed, the world around Elam did not stand still. Goods crossed longer distances, peoples moved, languages settled into some valleys and faded from others. New groups entered the region from the wider Iranian and steppe worlds, not all at once and not in one clean migration, but gradually, unevenly, over lifetimes too slow for legend and too mixed for simple origin stories. This is one of the quiet truths that history often hides behind names. Civilizations do not usually begin on a single morning. They accumulate. Roots helped make that accumulation possible. Tin from farther east, stone from highlands, timber from places where it could still be cut, finished goods from more urban societies, and stories from every direction all moved through the lands that would one day form the Persian centre. Trade is sometimes described as though it were only the movement of objects. But trade also moves expectations. It changes what people think is possible. It teaches them to imagine their world as part of larger systems. That is why Persia did not emerge in a vacuum. It emerged in a zone already trained in contact. Mountain and plain, settled village and moving pastoral life, local cult and borrowed god, native language and administrative language all coexisted for long stretches. Even when new Iranian-speaking groups became more prominent, older Elamite forms did not vanish overnight. Administrative habits can outlive rulers, sacred sites can outlive dynasties, a city can keep its usefulness through profound cultural change. This should remind us to picture becoming rather than replacement. The Persian world was not created by one people arriving and wiping the slate clean. It was formed by blending, adaptation, and inheritance. New elites could rule through old systems. New speech could pass through older institutions. What mattered most was not purity, but continuity of function. And continuity often feels sleepy when told properly, because it is not built from sudden drama. It is built from familiar acts, repeated under changing skies. People transporting goods through difficult country. Scribes keeping records in inherited forms, families adjusting to new rulers without forgetting older loyalties. Shrines receiving prayers from people whose ancestors would not have named the gods in exactly the same way. So when Persia eventually takes clearer shape, it is worth remembering that it is already old before it is named. It is already mixed before it is unified. It is already connected before it is imperial. The rise of overt Iranian power did not create the whole story. It drew a firmer outline around forces that had been gathering for a very long time. Among the Iranian-speaking peoples who entered this world, the Medes stand at an important threshold. They are not always remembered with the warmth given to Cyrus, or the grandeur later attached to the great Achaemenids. Yet they matter deeply because they represent one of the first larger efforts to gather the Iranian lands into a recognizably political form. Whether every traditional account can be trusted is less important than the wider truth they reflect. By the early first millennium before the Common Era, the Iranian world was no longer merely a patchwork of scattered peoples. It was beginning to imagine itself at scale. Pressure helped force that imagination into structure. The Assyrian Empire, fierce and disciplined, weighed heavily on the region. External threat often does what comfort does not. It teaches neighbouring groups to see themselves as participants in one danger, and therefore perhaps in one future. Under such pressure, federations become attractive. Leadership hardens, memory gets sharpened by necessity. The Medes appear in history at precisely that kind of moment. They belonged to the broader Iranian family, but they were shaped by the specific geography and politics of Western Iran, where contact with Mesopotamia, mountain traditions, and military threat all converged. Their political rise suggests not only ambition, but organization. The region was learning to coordinate power more effectively. There is something restful in seeing history form this way. Rather than a heroic figure appearing from nowhere to conjure an empire out of pure will, we see conditions gathering first. We see landscape, pressure, trade, and identity slowly preparing a people to accept wider rule. By the time famous names arrive, much of the work has already been done beneath the surface. The Medes also matter because they help us avoid a false beginning. If we start Persia only with Cyrus, we make later greatness feel almost miraculous. If we look at the Medes first, we see preparation. Cyrus did not invent the possibility of Iranian-wide power from nothing. He inherited a world already moving in that direction. So let the Medes stand in the half-light for a moment, not as the final shape, but as the first strong contour. In them, the Iranian lands begin to imagine cohesion. In them, the political centre starts to gather itself, and from that gathering, a more enduring order would soon emerge. When Cyrus enters the story, the tone changes. The old currents that had been slowly assembling beneath the surface find, at last, a figure capable of giving them clean direction. Many conquerors have expanded territory, far fewer have altered the grammar of empire itself. Cyrus belongs in that smaller company. He began within a world already shaped by medium power, and his early rise is partly hidden behind stories polished by later admiration. That is often the fate of foundational rulers. Memory drapes them in myth because ordinary description feels too small. Yet even if we strip away the legend, what remains is extraordinary enough. Cyrus built not merely by taking, but by integrating. He moved outward with force, certainly, but also with an unusual instinct for making victory durable. That instinct appears most clearly in the way he handled difference. The lands he absorbed were not empty spaces waiting to be standardized. They were full of old cities, priesthoods, customs, scribal cultures, and local elites. A lesser ruler might have tried to flatten them into obedience alone. Cyrus seems to have understood that durable rule in such a world required something more intelligent. Conquered peoples needed reasons to continue living within the new order, without feeling that all meaning had been stripped from them. This is why his memory became unusually generous across traditions. To some, he was not simply a conqueror, but a liberator, a ruler whose arrival felt less destructive than the systems he replaced. Such reputations are never entirely innocent, but they are never accidental either. They tell us something about style. Cyrus appears to have known that power gains depth when it presents itself as restoration rather than only seizure. Under him, Persian order acquired a moral tone as well as a military one. The empire was vast, yet it did not rely solely on endless violent display. It relied on the promise that diversity could remain legible inside a wider frame. This promise was not equality in any modern sense, nor was it softness. Rebellion could be punished, authority remained real, but the empire did not need to erase every local distinction in order to rule effectively. This mattered because Persia sat at the hinge of worlds. Westward lay ancient centres of urban civilization. Eastward opened long routes into Iranian interior lands, Central Asia, and beyond. Southward and northward stretched other ecologies, peoples, and trade corridors. No single rigid culture could have governed that entire zone for long. Cyrus answered breadth with flexibility, and yet his flexibility should not be mistaken for vagueness. He built structure. He gave the empire shape. He established a model later rulers would refine, but not fundamentally replace. A monarchy at the center, powerful regional governance, reliable lines of communication, and a disciplined sense that the empire existed not merely to extract tribute, but to hold a vast mosaic together. This is one reason Cyrus remains so luminous in political memory. Many rulers are admired for what they destroy. Cyrus is admired for what he made possible after conquest. He understood that empire survives not when everyone is made identical, but when different worlds can continue to breathe inside a strong frame. As you listen, let the image of him remain calm, rather than heroic in the crude sense. Not a man shouting above battle, but a ruler laying down forms, roads to be ridden, commands to be carried, customs to be tolerated, temples to be spared, a centre to which far provinces could still relate without losing themselves entirely. His genius was not only expansion, it was composition. He arranged the empire so it could outlast the emotional heat of victory, and in doing so, he gave Persia one of its deepest enduring traits. After Cyrus, Persian power was no longer simply a regional force. It became a method of organizing complexity. There is also something quietly sleep-friendly about the way his memory travels. He's remembered not only in royal language, but in the emotional afterlife of governance. A ruler who allows temples to stand, local custom to breathe, and far provinces to feel, seen leaves a different kind of echo from one who merely terrifies. Even if later generations polished that memory, they polished it because the stone beneath was already there. Cyrus became the image of measured power, and measured power is rarer and more enduring than the loud kind. Once the empire had been shaped, it needed to function. This is where Persia becomes especially interesting, because the marvel is not only that it grew vast, but that it remained governable. The romance of empire often focuses on battles and coronations, but everyday durability depends on less dramatic things. Offices, routes, reports, oversight, habit. The Persian solution was elegant. The empire was divided into large provinces under governors, often remembered by the term satraps. These governors exercised real authority, because a realm of such size could not be ruled minute by minute from a single throne. Yet autonomy was balanced by surveillance, review, and the steady presence of the king's interest. Power radiated outward, but it also flowed back in the form of information. This matters more than it might first seem. Information is the hidden pulse of every state. A ruler who cannot know what is happening beyond the horizon does not really rule. Persia confronted this reality with one of the ancient world's great communication systems. Roads linked major centers. Couriers moved with remarkable speed. Stations offered rest, supplies, and fresh mounts. Messages became less vulnerable to the exhaustion of individual bodies because the system itself carried them. In a sleep story, roads can be strangely soothing. Picture them not as military lines only, but as ribbons of continuity stretching across varied worlds. On them move envoys, tax records, letters, orders, gifts, intelligence, and rumors. They bind the empire without forcing every place to become the same. The road is a promise that distance can be crossed. The empire also used multiple capitals, which reveals an important truth about Persian political imagination. Rather than insisting that all dignity be contained in one center, it allowed prestige and function to be distributed. Susa, with its old Elamite depth, remained vitally important. Other capitals served courtly, ceremonial, or seasonal purposes. This was not administrative confusion, it was imperial realism. A realm of many climates, peoples, and historical layers needed more than one symbolic doorway. What emerges is a portrait of Persian power, as rhythm rather than sheer force. Governors govern, but are watched. Provinces keep their identities, but are tied into a larger mechanism. Messages move, revenue flows, the court circulates, the centre remains present even when distant. And because so much of this depended on preserving local intelligibility, the empire often felt less like a crushing weight than like a vast frame resting over many pre-existing worlds. No empire eliminates corruption, ambition, or weakness. Persia was not a utopia, but it achieved something remarkable for its age. It made scale feel manageable. It turned immensity into habit. If you have ever wondered why Persian influence seemed able to revive after collapse, part of the answer lies here. Administrative memory survives longer than individual rulers. Once a region has learned the feel of coordinated roads, provincial governance, and central oversight, future dynasties can inherit the pattern, even after a dramatic break. Forms remember, institutions linger. The empire lives on in the muscle memory of how to rule. Yet an empire is not truly understood from its palaces alone. To know Persia more gently, we have to descend from the royal road into the everyday country it crossed. We have to leave the throne room and stand near orchards, village channels, cool storage, milling water, shaded courtyards, and the practical intelligence of people making life possible in a dry land. In such a landscape, water is never just a resource. It is discipline, cooperation, and foresight made visible. The famous underground channels later associated so strongly with Iranian civilization carried this logic beautifully. They drew water from hidden reserves and led it across long distances with such careful grading that the precious flow would continue without tearing the earth apart. Their genius was not flashy. It was precise, patient, almost humble, but humility can sustain a civilization better than spectacle. Imagine the labour required, surveying the slope, digging through stubborn ground, ventilating the channels with vertical shafts, keeping the line true enough for water to move, yet gentle enough that it would not destroy its own path. The result was not merely irrigation, it was confidence. Villages, gardens, and fields could exist where surface conditions alone would have discouraged them. The harshness of the land was not denied, but answered intelligently. And water led to other forms of comfort. There were systems for diversion and milling, for cooling and storage, for preserving food beyond the seasons that had produced it. Even the idea of storing winter cold for later use carries something poetic in it. A civilization strong enough to capture ice against future heat has already learned one of history's deepest lessons. Survival depends on preparing tenderness in advance. This is the part of Persian greatness that can feel most restorative in a script like this. Grand conquest wakes the mind, everyday civilization soothes it. A road is impressive, a shaded garden at the end of the road is more intimate. A king's decree matters, so does the cool water reaching a settlement through earth, the colour of sun-baked clay. The empire's daily life was shaped by many regions and older traditions. In some provinces, slavery had long existed before Persian power and continued under it in varied forms, though the empire does not seem to have rested on slave labour to the same degree as some later societies. Women in Persian settings appear, at least in comparison with several neighbouring classical cultures, to have held notable room for movement, ownership, and agency. Courtly and aristocratic women could travel, manage resources, and participate in activities associated elsewhere more tightly with men. Society was hardly free in a modern sense, yet it was textured enough to resist crude simplification. When we remember Persia only through war, all of this disappears. The canals, the storehouses, the orchards, the domestic economies, the layered provincial lives, the sense that administration and environment met each other every day in practical ways. All of it fades into background. But this background is where civilization actually happens. It is where the empire becomes livable. So after the grandeur of rulers and systems, let us remain here a little longer, where water runs cool beneath dry ground, and the ordinary intelligence of survival softens the whole story. In such details, Persia becomes not merely powerful, but inhabitable. Think, too, of the Persian garden, that carefully ordered meeting of shade, water, wall, path, fruit, scent, and measured geometry. In a severe climate, the garden is not decorative in a trivial sense. It is a philosophical statement. It says that harshness can be answered with arrangement, that dryness can be softened by intelligence, that life can be made not only possible but beautiful. To rest inside such a garden, hearing water move and leaves stir, while dust and heat remain outside, is to understand Persia at one of its gentlest depths. To understand Persia fully, we have to look not only at how it governed land and moved water, but at how it imagined the world. Civilizations endure for longer than expected when they offer a convincing moral atmosphere around daily life. They do not survive on force alone. They survive because people know how to think, how to hope, how to rank what is clean and unclean, true and false, worthy and unworthy. Persia inherited older sacred habits from the lands before it, but it also gave them new clarity. One of the most striking things about the Persian world, especially when compared with several neighbouring societies of antiquity, is the relative space visible around women in property, movement, and presence. That does not mean equality as we might define it now, and we should resist easy idealization. Yet the texture matters. Women appear in records as economic actors. Elite women could travel. Some moved through court and estate life with authority. In cultural memory, Persian womanhood did not seem destined to be reduced quite as completely to silence as in some classical Mediterranean traditions. That alone gives the civilization a different emotional temperature. And then there is religion, which in Persian history often feels less like an isolated institution than like an atmosphere of order. Older Iranian and Elamite layers had already attached sacred significance to elements of the natural world, to heights, to groves, to the living environment. Over time, these tendencies gathered into the moral and cosmological force associated with Zoroastrian tradition. Here, the world was no longer merely a place where gods demanded ritual. It was a field of truth and falsehood, right alignment and corruption, light and destructive disorder. What makes this so memorable is not just doctrine, but tone. Fire, for example, was not only a physical element. It became a visible companion to prayer, a sign of presence, purity, attention. There is something almost perfectly suited to a night narrative in that image. A flame held carefully in darkness, not as spectacle, but as steadiness. Flowing water, too, retained sacred resonance. Nature was not erased by theology. It was interpreted through it. The ethical idea often associated with Persian thought. The idea that truth, rightness, and proper order belong together gave the civilization a distinctive kind of dignity. Kings could claim legitimacy not merely through blood or victory, but through alignment with a deeper moral structure. This did not prevent cruelty, ambition, or hypocrisy. No high ideal ever does, but it shaped the language in which power had to justify itself. That language mattered. A ruler presented as guardian of order behaves differently. or at least speaks differently, from a ruler presented as brute owner of the world. Even when reality falls short, ideals leave marks. They shape law, administration, self-understanding and memory. They help explain why the Persian imperial style often appeared to later observers as more disciplined, more thoughtful, and at moments more humane than they expected from a conqueror. So by the time we reach the mature Persian world, we are no longer looking at a military machine alone. We are looking at a civilization of roads, water, provinces, estates, households, sacred fire, moral language, and a sense that truth itself had political weight. That is part of why Persia cast such a long shadow. It offered not only power, but a way of arranging the world emotionally. Yet even emotionally coherent civilizations reach their edges. Every empire eventually discovers that some horizons can be approached more easily than absorbed. For Persia, one of those horizons lay in the west, where another set of proud cultures watched its expansion with fear, fascination, and defiance. When Persian power reached toward the Greek world, later memory would turn the encounter into drama almost too sharp for sleep. The temptation is always to tell it as a clean opposition. East against west, despot against freedom, vast empire against small but spirited cities. But history is rarely so tidy, and Persia itself was much larger, older, and more internally diverse than the old Greek imagination allowed. Still, the Western campaigns matter because they revealed something important about limits. Darius, and then Xerxes, inherited an empire accustomed to enormous scale. From the Iranian heartland, Persian influence stretched across regions that had long been urban, wealthy, and connected. Expanding farther into the Aegean orbit may have seemed less like a leap into the unknown than another extension of a successful pattern. Yet the pattern did not fit every coastline equally. Geography changed, naval dependence grew, local politics became more fragmented and less predictable. A cluster of fiercely independent city-states, often divided among themselves, could nevertheless become stubborn when confronted by imperial pressure. Campaigns that might have looked manageable on a vast map became complicated in narrow passages, on uncertain seas, and among communities whose identities were built around refusal. This is where the Persian story becomes most famous in the Western tradition. But fame can distort proportion. Setbacks in Greece were real, yet they were only one edge of a much larger world. Persia remained immensely wealthy, organized and powerful, long after Marathon or Salamis. Its defeat was not immediate civilizational collapse. It was a reminder that frontier conditions matter, and that even a flexible empire cannot make every geography obey the same political rhythm. For a sleep narrative, the important thing is not to linger on the crash of battle, but on the lesson beneath it. Persia discovered that power has edges, and edges reveal the difference between reach and possession. The empire could burn a city and still fail to domesticate the world beyond it. It could command armies larger than most contemporaries could imagine, and still find that terrain, timing, weather, and human stubbornness softened imperial certainty. There is a tenderness even in this limitation. An empire that cannot do everything becomes easier to understand. It becomes less monstrous and more human. Persian power remained magnificent, but magnificence had contour. It was strongest where its systems, roads, provincial habits, and administrative logic could operate with confidence. It was weaker where logistics frayed and local resistance hardened into something strategic. So let the Greek frontier remain in the story as a western edge rather than a final judgment. Persia did not cease to be Persia because some campaigns failed. The centre remained, the roads still ran, water still moved under dry earth. Sacred fire still burned in prayer, and that is why the next great shock, when it came, would matter so much more than these Western frustrations. It would strike not only the edge, but the imperial body itself. That shock arrived in the form of Alexander, and even now it is difficult to speak of him without feeling how differently he moved through history than most rulers. He belonged to that rare and dangerous type whose personal energy seems able, for a brief time, to bend structures larger than himself. Persia had faced many enemies before. What made Alexander unusual was not only his talent, but the precise moment at which his talent met a vulnerable imperial centre. His campaigns were brilliant, ruthless, and accelerated by a court at the Persian top that no longer matched the composure of the empire it ruled. In another age, against another emperor, perhaps the struggle would have taken a different shape. But history is often decided not by general decline alone, nor by genius alone, but by the unsettling fit between one and the other. Alexander was daring enough to exploit weakness wherever he sensed it, and the imperial leadership opposing him seems not to have inspired the wide confidence needed in such moments. As Persian armies failed to convert their size into decisive steadiness, the emotional centre of the empire weakened. In a realm composed of many peoples and many loyalties, confidence in the king mattered immensely. When that confidence thinned, scale itself could become strangely fragile. Alexander, who often led with frightening personal visibility, offered his own men something intensely magnetic, not simply Macedonian command, but a human focus for courage and reward. By contrast, a frightened centre in Persia could make a huge empire feel suddenly hollow. And yet, even here, where the old Achaemenid frame cracked, something softer should be noticed. Alexander did not conquer an emptiness. He stepped into a world already thick with roads, capitals, estates, treasuries, and administrative habits. He could seize Persepolis and shock the imperial imagination. He could win battles that broke royal confidence, but he could not unwind the civilizational fabric beneath the courtly layer so easily. That is why the burning of palaces, though dramatic, is never the whole story. Fire consumes wood, textiles, stored wealth, display, ceremony. It does not so easily consume distributed habits, regional administration, urban memory, agricultural knowledge, road systems, or the identity of a people who have already lived through layered centuries. The empire as a ruling house could be broken. Persia as a historical centre was harder to kill. So here, after the intensity of conquest, we should pause. Let the noise pass, let the hoofbeats fade, imagine the ruins cooling in the night, smoke lifting into a sky that has seen too many kings. Beneath the shock, villages continue, water still seeks its line, scribes still know how to record, nobles still calculate, priests still remember, and households still wake to ordinary needs. This is how civilizations survive dramatic defeats. They retreat from spectacle into habit. Alexander changed the map, but he did not end the Persian pattern. He interrupted one expression of it. He laid a Greek and Macedonian layer across lands that would absorb it unevenly. And as that new layer settled, Persia prepared once again to return in another form. The Hellenistic age that followed Alexander is often imagined as a triumph of Greekness, spreading eastward in bright, clean lines. But real life is almost always blurrier than imperial self-description. Greek speech, Greek elitis, Greek city forms, and Greek cultural prestige certainly expanded. New foundations carried the conqueror's name, courts spoke in new accents, aristocracies shifted, yet beneath that overlay, the older lands continued to breathe through their own inherited rhythms. This is why the post-Alexander world is best imagined, not as replacement, but as layering. Greek rulers governed large eastern territories, but governance itself still depended on provincial realities they had not invented. Local populations did not awaken one morning as strangers to themselves. They adjusted, negotiated, married, traded, worshipped, and remembered under altered ceilings. The old Iranian lands proved capable of taking in foreign prestige without surrendering their deeper coherence. There was also something inherently temporary about purely imported power at such a distance from its emotional centre. Greek rule in the East produced striking cultural mixtures, some brilliant and lasting, but it also depended on corridors of legitimacy that grew thinner the farther they stretched from the old Mediterranean worlds. In Iran and beyond, the Greek layer became one ingredient among others, not the final definition of the region. This mixed period is important because it reveals one of Persia's quiet strengths: absorbency. The civilization did not defend itself only by resisting. It also defended itself by incorporating. It could take foreign forms, smooth their edges, repurpose their prestige, and slowly recenter life around older geographic and cultural logics. The result was not purity restored, but continuity renewed through mixture. There is something soothing in that. We often imagine survival as hard refusal, yet some of the deepest survival in history happens through selective acceptance. Persia did not have to remain unchanged to remain itself. It only had to ensure that change did not uproot the centre entirely. And because the centre was geographic, administrative, and cultural all at once, it was surprisingly difficult to uproot. So while Greek courts governed and Hellenistic culture shimmered across the wider map, the Iranian heartland waited with the old patience of mountain memory. The next phase would not be a simple return to what had been before. History never grants that kind of innocence, but it would restore something unmistakably Persian, a renewed empire grounded once again in the Iranian world. That renewed form came with the Parthians, and with them the Persian pattern revealed one of its favourite habits: return through apparent outsiders who are, in time, absorbed into the very centre they come to rule. The Parthians had roots in the northeastern Iranian and steppe worlds, and in their rise we feel again the old interaction between movement and settlement, mounted life and imperial aspiration, frontier energy and civilizational inheritance. What makes the Parthian restoration especially interesting is that it was not a nostalgic copy of the old Achaemenid order. It was something different, leaner in certain respects, more aristocratic, more visibly marked by its steppe background, yet still recognizably attached to the same broad Persian geography. The centre had returned, even though its manner had changed. Against the Seleucid heirs of Alexander, the Parthians benefited from distance, mobility, and timing. But once again, success meant more than military victory. To hold Iran and the surrounding regions required entry into a much older administrative and cultural field. A conqueror of Persia could not remain only a conqueror for long. The land insisted on governance. It insisted on hierarchy, taxation, negotiation, provincial order, and symbolic legitimacy. In time, the Parthians ceased to look like intruders and began to look like another chapter in the continuing Persian story. They also became one of Rome's great eastern rivals, and here the sleep story can enjoy the image without dwelling too long on combat. Mounted archers on open ground, turning in the saddle to fire backward as pursuit stretches too far. Long frontiers, where two giant systems watch one another, warily across deserts, rivers, and client kingdoms. Rome, so used to pressing outward, found in Parthia a power capable of denying easy eastern expansion. The old Persian centre, had not only returned, it had returned with new military grammar. Parthian political life seems to have possessed a different balance from some earlier empires. The nobility held unusual weight. Kingship was real, but elite consensus mattered in ways that could at times soften succession, crises, or restrain arbitrary rule. This did not make the realm gentle, but it gave it a particular texture of stability. Persian history was showing again that there was no single correct form for the centre, only recurrent structural conditions that successful rulers had to satisfy. And culturally, the age was rich in mixture. Greek residues remained, Iranian traditions deepened, religious ideas travelled, local worlds continued their daily negotiations with imperial frames. This should make the Parthian period feel less like a pause between better-known dynasties and more like a living proof of resilience. Persia had not merely survived Alexander. It had reasserted itself through a new synthesis. Let this be one of the script's most comforting truths. Civilizations do not always return looking familiar enough for impatient observers. Sometimes they come back, disguised in new elites, new military styles, new courtly habits. But if the centre is restored, if the roots reconnect, if the old heartland becomes once more the organizing force of the region, then the return is real. And under the Parthians, it was very real indeed. The Parthian age was powerful, but the next restoration would feel even more self-aware. With the Sasanians, Persia did not merely return as a large Eastern empire. It returned with a stronger sense of Iranian inheritance, a more centralized courtly ambition, and a renewed determination to place Persian culture at the center of its own world. There is a fullness to the Sasanian moment that makes it especially satisfying in long historical perspective. After the mixture and aristocratic looseness of earlier centuries, the new dynasty gave the Iranian heartland a sharper profile. Kingship took on greater formal depth. Zoroastrian tradition was elevated into state importance. Administration tightened. Urban and courtly life gained fresh confidence. The empire did not reject all that had come before, but it arranged the pieces in a more distinctly Persian order. And this order stood face to face with another great organized rival, Rome in its later Eastern form, the empire we call Byzantine. The long duel between these two powers shaped the Near East for generations. Yet again, battle is only one surface. Beneath it lay an extraordinary density of civilization. Trade moved along the Silk Road, diplomatic rituals matured, crafts, architecture, legal habits, intellectual traditions, and artistic styles all deepened. The Sasanian world has often been described as classical Persia at full civilizational weight, and that description feels deserved. Imagine cities where court ceremony carried carefully calibrated meaning, where noble houses and state religion intertwined, where merchants understood their place in routes stretching toward India and China, where texts, stories, and sacred formulas moved through institutions old enough to feel almost inevitable. The empire was not simply defending borders, it was projecting a coherent social cosmos. This coherence mattered far beyond its own time. Later, Islamic courts, often unconsciously to distant observers, inherited much from Persian administrative and ceremonial models shaped in this and earlier ages. Foreigners would eventually treat many Persian forms as generally Oriental or generally Islamic, forgetting how much specifically Iranian refinement stood behind them. That too is a kind of survival, influence so complete that its origins are blurred. The Sasanian moment also reminds us that Persia's genius lay not only in endurance but in recomposition. Each major restoration took older elements and rearranged them for a new age. The result was never static repetition, it was continuity through redesign. Roads, provinces, court culture, sacred authority, Eastern trade, Western rivalry, all were drawn together once more around the Iranian center. If you listen closely, this section should feel like a long, steady plateau after many rises and falls. Persia has come back again, and now it stands with great weight. The structure feels complete. That feeling is precisely what makes the next rupture so poignant, because when a civilization reaches such fullness, its breaking is felt more deeply than ordinary defeat. The eastern connections of this world deserve a moment of stillness too. Caravans moved with silk, spices, dyes, metalwork, horses, stories, and techniques. Musicians, craftsmen, monks, envoys, and merchants crossed the same broad system, carrying culture as surely as goods. Persia was not only defending itself against Rome, it was also participating in a larger Eurasian conversation, and that conversation enriched its courtly and urban life with textures no frontier state could have created alone. The break came not because Persia had become empty, but because exhaustion and timing can damage even dense civilizations. After prolonged struggle with Byzantium, after plague, after internal strain, after pressures on the frontier, the Sasanian order became more vulnerable than its outward magnificence suggested. This is one of history's sadder lessons. A society can appear complete, even while its reserves are thinning. When the Arab-Muslim conquests arrived, they did not meet a fresh and tranquil rival. They met a state already won by decades of attrition. The speed with which the old imperial structure fell has often startled later readers, but speed at the end can conceal the slowness of weakening beforehand. Once the centre fails decisively, long-prepared cracks widen quickly. For Persia, this meant the loss of sovereignty in the old form and the beginning of one of its most remarkable transformations. Conquest brought violence, hierarchy, new rulers, new taxes, new religious pressures, and eventually large-scale change in the spiritual profile of the land. Yet conversion was not instantaneous, cultural surrender was not automatic. The people of the Iranian world did not wake and forget themselves. They endured the new frame while gradually reshaping it from within. This is perhaps one of the greatest Persian achievements of all, though it is quieter than imperial victory. The civilization that had been conquered profoundly influenced the civilization that conquered it. Administrative methods, courtly refinement, intellectual habits, narrative traditions, and forms of political imagination from the Persian world passed into the caliphal order. Over time, Baghdad itself, though Arab in political origin, became one of the great heirs to the older Mesopotamian and Persian zone of learning and administration. The Islamic Golden Age, so often narrated in broad civilizational terms, drew deeply from Persian participation. Scholars, officials, translators, physicians, poets, secretaries and thinkers worked in a world where inherited Greek, Indian, Mesopotamian and Persian knowledge could be preserved, debated and expanded. Persian culture was no longer ruling the region alone, but it was helping to teach the new order how to govern and how to think. This is why the conquest should not be told as simple extinction. It was a wound, yes, and in many lives a brutal one. Old sacred texts were lost, fire temples faded, Zoroastrian communities contracted, new religious power altered the texture of public life. But the deeper Persian habits of absorbency persisted. The civilization survived partly by transmitting itself into the institutions and imagination of the age that followed. There is also a softer emotional truth here. Faith changed, but continuity did not vanish. People still married, farmed, traded, recited, recorded, travelled, and served administrations across the same broad geography. Cities still mattered, roots still mattered. The old centre did not disappear from history. It changed its clothing. So after the ache of conquest, we return to safer ground. Persia has again lost one visible form of itself, yet beneath the new religious and imperial ceiling, it continues its patient work of endurance. It remains one of the great memory bearers of the region, now speaking through altered institutions, altered prayers, and altered loyalties, but still undeniably present. Even in loss, the Persian world displayed an old talent for inward survival. Families adapted one generation at a time. Officials served new rulers with inherited skill. Poets preserved tone where institutions had changed. The visible crown had fallen, but the underlying civilization continued to tutor the age that had conquered it. The Persian world had already proven that it could survive conquest, absorb foreign rule, and rebuild itself around older centers. But the Mongol invasions introduced a scale of destruction that felt different even against this long background of endurance. Earlier nomadic conquerors had often entered, taken power, and then settled into existing administrative and cultural patterns with surprising speed. The Mongols carried a far more devastating momentum. Cities were not merely seized, they were broken. Populations were not merely subordinated, they were slaughtered or scattered. Libraries, workshops, irrigation works, and urban continuities that had taken centuries to refine could be undone in terrifyingly short spans of time. For Persia, this mattered not only as human tragedy, but as structural damage. In a dry civilization, irrigation is memory-made material. When channels collapse and maintenance stops, fields do not simply wait politely for politics to improve. They fail, settlements shrink, skilled habits disappear. Prosperity retreats into smaller islands. The destruction of urban and hydraulic infrastructure strikes deeper than the fall of a palace because it harms the very fabric through which ordinary life reproduces itself. And yet even the Mongol storm did not end the Persian pattern permanently. In time, rule stabilized under successor formations. Trade revived in part, routes reopened. The conquerors themselves changed through contact with the lands they held. Many embraced Islam. Court life refined itself. Persian bureaucratic, literary and artistic influence quietly reasserted its pull. This has happened so often in Iranian history that it almost feels like a law. Conquerors arrive with violence, but if they remain, the land begins to educate them. Still, the cost was immense, and recovery was never pure. Then came another shock. The great plague waves of the 14th century thinned populations further, and as if pestilence were not enough, another conqueror appeared, one whose name entered memory with an especially cold dread. Timur, lame from old wounds and colossal in ambition, moved through the region with a brutality that made already wounded lands tremble again. He could patronize architecture and poetry with one hand while leveling cities with the other. His campaigns are a reminder that aesthetic refinement and moral restraint do not always travel together. What matters for us tonight is not to catalogue each horror, but to feel the weight of repetition. Persia was struck again when it was trying to recover, and yet even this did not abolish it. Fragmented, wounded, intermittently ruled by shifting confederations and regional powers, the old Iranian heartland still retained something that later centuries could build upon. Political unity had been badly shattered, but memory had not been erased. This helps explain why, in the turmoil that followed, religious movements gained such power. When political forms fail repeatedly, people begin to seek order in symbols deeper than dynasty. In Iran, forms of Shia devotion and identity grew in significance, not as an abstract theology alone, but as a means of moral and communal reassembly. This would prove decisive, because when a new Persian state rose in the early modern period. It would do so with a renewed religious profile, strong enough to distinguish it sharply from its great western rival. That state was the Safavid Empire, and its rise marks one of the most consequential reformings of Persian history. Here again, the pattern of mixed origins and integrated identities appears. The new ruling line emerged from a world where Turkic Iranian, Kurdish, Caucasian, and other strands had crossed and settled into one another. Persia did not return through ethnic simplicity. It returned through synthesis. The rulers who gathered the Iranian lands understood that legitimacy in this region required more than military command. It required symbolic depth. Under the Safavids, Iran became more firmly identified with Twelver Shi'ism, a transformation that permanently altered the spiritual and political map of the Middle East. This religious consolidation did not erase older Persian habits. Rather, it gave them a new vessel: court ceremony, state ambition, literary culture, urban patronage, and the old instinct for regional centrality all found new expression under a distinctly Shia imperial frame. Once more, Persia had recomposed itself. The Safavid state also stood in a dramatic relationship with its western neighbour, the Ottoman Empire. Here, the old contest over Mesopotamia, the Caucasus and borderlands returned in gunpowder form. The rivalry was military, political, and confessional all at once. Yet even while facing such pressure, the Safavid order cultivated extraordinary urban and artistic life. Isfahan, above all, became one of those cities that feel less like settlements than like arguments made in stone, tile, water, and proportion. To walk there in imagination is to feel that Persia, after so many upheavals, had recovered not only authority but grace. Let us linger in that grace, picture wide avenues, gardens planned with intelligence, mosques whose surfaces hold light in blue and gold, courtyards arranged around calm, and commerce flowing through bazaars, rich with textiles, metalwork, perfume, and story. Persian carpets travel outward, silk moves through trade networks. Diplomacy links Iran not only to neighbouring Muslim powers, but to European states interested in commerce and alliance. Once again, the Persian centre is not isolated. It is plugged into multiple worlds, and yet early modern recovery did not solve everything. Power remained vulnerable to bad succession, court weakness, provincial strain, and the growing imbalance between the Islamic empires and an increasingly scientific, industrial, and expansionist Europe. Like other great states of the early modern world, Persia would discover that preserving sovereignty in an age of changing global power required new forms of adaptation. Some rulers could not provide them. Others tried with mixed success. When Safavid strength declined, familiar dangers returned. Neighbouring empires took interest in Persian weakness. Borderlands slipped. Internal disorder widened. Nader Shah, brilliant and frightening, managed for a time to restore Iranian military power with astonishing force, even launching spectacular campaigns into India and reconquering lost territories. But his rule also shows the old Persian dilemma in another form. Military restoration alone is not the same as stable civilizational repair. A conqueror may refill the treasury and expand the map, yet leave behind fear, exhaustion, and succession, chaos once he is gone. After him came more fragmentation, more contest, more attempts to gather the centre again. The Qajar dynasty eventually did so, but by then the world around Iran had changed decisively. The age of industrial empires had arrived, and Persia now faced not neighbouring rivals alone, but foreign powers equipped with new forms of finance, extraction, transport, and imperial interference. Russia, pressed from the north, Britain manoeuvred from the south and from India. Old frontier contest became entangled with global strategy. This period can feel especially sorrowful because the old Persian pattern of return remained alive. Yet autonomy was compromised in humiliating ways. Territories in the Caucasus were lost, concessions were granted. Foreign influence seeped into courts, commerce and infrastructure. Oil, once discovered, did not simply enrich the country. It intensified the interest of outsiders and deepened the stakes of internal control. Persia was still there, still full of memory and intelligence, but now it had to endure a new kind of domination, not straightforward annexation in every case, but manipulation, partition of influence, and economic pressure. And still, the pattern did not die. Constitutional movements arose. Reformers, clerics, merchants, intellectuals, and ordinary subjects pushed against arbitrary monarchy and foreign intrusion alike. The very struggle to define a modern Iranian state became another way in which Persia refused to vanish. What was being fought over was not merely a throne. It was the right to decide what form the old centre would take in a modern world. The Pahlavi era that followed introduced yet another recomposition. Here, the state pursued centralization, nationalism, secular legal reform, military strengthening, and visible modernization with urgency and often with coercion. Railways, new institutions, educational change, altered dress codes, and the cultivation of pre-Islamic Iranian identity all formed part of an effort to make the country strong enough to resist humiliation. But strength imposed from above can produce its own backlash, especially when large parts of the population feel that dignity, faith, or social continuity are being handled too harshly. This tension intensified across the 20th century. Foreign intervention, especially around oil and strategic positioning, continued to wound public trust. National aspirations collided with monarchical ambition and outside influence. The overthrow of leaders, the struggle over resource control, and the visible intimacy between the Shah's state and Western power created an atmosphere in which modernization no longer felt purely like renewal. For many, it began to feel like estrangement. The revolution of 1979 transformed Iran once again, bringing religion decisively back into state form, but not as a simple return to older Persia, and not as a mere rejection of modernity either. It was another recomposition under pressure, another attempt to answer the question that has followed the Iranian world for millennia. How should this old centre exist in relation to power, belief, and the outside world? The answer given by the Islamic Republic was sharp, uncompromising, and deeply consequential. It reordered politics, society, foreign relations, and the meaning of legitimacy. Then came war with Iraq, a conflict whose deep background reached far beyond the modern map. In another sense, one could say the old encounter of plain and plateau, Mesopotamia and Iran, had entered a mechanized 20th century form. The war was devastating, exhausting, and formative. It hardened institutions, sanctified sacrifice in public memory, and anchored the new regime in a narrative of survival under assault. Once again Persia, now Iran, had been struck and had endured. Today, the country still stands in the old middle place between worlds, negotiating sanctions, regional rivalry, internal complexity, religious authority, historical memory, and modern aspiration. Its influence reaches beyond its borders in ways that recall earlier Persian patterns. Yet its constraints are also immense. It is at once ancient and unfinished, proud and pressured, deeply itself, and constantly forced to adapt. And perhaps that is exactly what Persia has always been. Not a frozen inheritance, but a civilization whose truest form is the capacity to reassemble after damage. So when we speak of the long reassembly, we are not speaking only of one dynasty after another. We are speaking of a civilizational habit. Breakage does not end the story, it becomes part of the material from which the next form is built. Persia survives not because it escapes history, but because it can keep making history out of what history has done to it. If we step back now, away from the names and dates and capital cities, a quieter shape becomes visible. Persia returns because too many kinds of strength overlap there for defeat ever to be final. Geography is one of them. The Iranian plateau is not incidental scenery, but a structural reality. It sits between worlds without dissolving into either. It opens roots while preserving defensible depth. It contains harshness, and harshness trains continuity. Conquerors may cross it, but few can make it wholly forget itself. Trade is another strength. For thousands of years, the lands of Iran linked regions that might otherwise have remained more distant from one another. Goods passed through, but so did habits of mediation. A society positioned at such a crossroads learns versatility. It learns translation, brokerage, selective tolerance, and the value of holding together unlike worlds. This does not make it peaceful by nature, but it does make it difficult to simplify. A civilization trained in connection can survive the fall of particular regimes, because its usefulness is broader than any one court. Then there is administrative memory. Once a land has repeatedly generated large-scale political organization, later rulers inherit more than ruins. They inherit precedents, they inherit roads, taxable expectations, scribal habits, provincial awareness, ceremonial vocabulary, and a sense that the center ought to govern at scale. Even when one empire collapses, the idea of empire remains near at hand. Persia returns partly because the possibility of return never disappears from political imagination. Cultural absorbency may be the most subtle strength of all. Persia survives not by sealing itself off, but by taking in what it cannot wholly repel, and making it speak with an Iranian accent. Elamite inheritances pass into later forms. Iranian-speaking newcomers absorb older administrative worlds. Greek layers are retained, blurred, or repurposed. Islam conquers Persia politically, and Persia then helps shape Islamic civilization intellectually and administratively. Turkic and Mongol dynasts rule in Iran, and Persianate culture flows through their courts. A weaker civilization is erased by contact. A stronger one learns how to digest. Religion, too, has played this role. Sacred fire, moral truth, sheer memory, poetic mysticism, legal rigor, saintly devotion, martyrdom, royal splendor, all these forms have, at different moments, carried Persian continuity across rupture. Faith in the Iranian world has rarely been only private consolation. It has been a way of binding society, narrating suffering, dignifying resistance, and imagining legitimacy. This is why spiritual change never meant civilizational amnesia. The deeper Persian instinct was to settle new belief into older landscapes of meaning. Language and literature matter no less. Even where political sovereignty weakened, Persian speech and writing could preserve a world. Poems, chronicles, mirrors for princes, romances, mystical works, epics, and administrative prose all carried continuity through periods of foreign rule. A civilization with strong literary memory can remain sovereign in imagination long before it regains sovereignty in law. The page becomes a homeland of form, and then there is the emotional quality that has accompanied the Persian story from the beginning: patience. Not passivity, but patience, a capacity to absorb the long view, a willingness, forced or chosen, to endure bad rulers, failed courts, defeated armies, broken canals, changing dynasties, and still continue building households, tending fields, reciting poems, copying texts, arranging marriages, teaching children, and restoring cities. Empires are often narrated from the top. Survival is made from below. This is why the Persian story has such power in a sleep narrative. It is not ultimately the story of a people who win every contest. It is the story of a civilization that remains legible to itself after contests are lost. That is a quieter form of greatness, and perhaps a more human one. If you listen to the entire arc carefully, you may notice that Persia is strongest not at the moments when it looks most aggressive, but at the moments when it most successfully combines force with form. Cyrus matters because he composes. The great administrators matter because they maintain rhythm. The builders of Qanats matter because they translate intelligence into daily survival. Religious thinkers matter because they bind ethics to order. Urban patrons matter because they give shape to beauty. Poets matter because they preserve continuity in language. The civilization returns whenever these forces gather again in one place. And so the real question is no longer why Persia fell. Every empire falls in one way or another. The more revealing question is why Persia could fall repeatedly without becoming blank. The answer, after all we have seen, is that Persia was never only a state. It was a civilizational center where geography, memory, administration, belief, and adaptation learned to cooperate across extreme spans of time. Some places are merely occupied on the map. Persia became inhabitable in history. That is why conquerors kept needing it. That is why they were changed by it. That is why, once they were gone, the old center could gather itself again. You can hear this return even in the sequence of names. Elam, Media, Achaemenid Persia, Parthia, Sasanian Iran, Persianate Caliphal worlds, Safavid Iran, modern Iran with its ancient shadow still attached. The names differ, the confessions differ, the languages of legitimacy differ, and still the center remains strangely continuous. The map is revised, but the pulse is familiar. There is an almost geological calm in that realization. We spend so much time in history looking for sudden causes, decisive heroes, dramatic endings. Persia teaches another lesson. Continuity can hide under catastrophe. The deepest structures of a civilization often move more slowly than the events that seem to destroy them. Beneath the flames, beneath the invasions, beneath the proclamations of new ages, older layers continue their patient work. And perhaps that is the hidden invitation of this whole journey. If a civilization can survive by absorbing change without dissolving into it, then history is not only a record of endings. It is also a record of returns. Persia's long endurance asks us to see permanence not as stillness, but as the ability to remain oneself while passing through transformation. That is why it always seems to return. It returns because it never wholly leaves. Now let the names grow softer. Let the armies move farther away. Let the courts, the rivalries, the banners, and the proclamations sink back into the long dark, where all human noise eventually settles. We end where perhaps we should always have begun, with the land itself. Imagine night again, over the Iranian plateau. The mountains stand in patient silence, as they stood before Elam, before Cyrus, before Alexander, before caliphs and shahs and revolutions and modern states. A road crosses the distance, perhaps paved, perhaps only remembered in the body by those who have travelled it for generations. Somewhere beneath dry ground, water follows a line drawn long ago by hands that understood slope, time, and thirst. Somewhere a city sleeps on foundations older than its current name. Somewhere a small flame burns in a room where prayer, memory, and ordinary life have not fully separated. This is what remains when history quiets enough to be heard properly. Not victory alone, not loss alone, but endurance. A land learning, age after age, how to carry itself through change. A people inheriting forms that were already ancient when their grandparents spoke them. A civilization that seems to understand more deeply than most. That survival is not the same as stasis. One can change and still continue. One can be wounded and still remain. Perhaps that is why the Persian story is so well suited to the edge of sleep. It does not ask us to cling to one bright moment of triumph. It teaches us to feel continuity in slower things, in roads repaired, in gardens watered, in verses remembered, in buildings restored, in moral languages that outlast courts, in the way a centre can vanish politically and remain spiritually, culturally, geographically near at hand. If you listen carefully now, the story no longer moves in sharp chapters. It becomes atmosphere, the mountain memory, the cool underground water, the long caravan route between worlds, the palace burned and the city rebuilt, the old religion fading and yet leaving its light in newer forms, the empire broken and the centre returning, over and over, not with the sameness of repetition, but with the steadiness of breathing. And so there is no need for a hard ending tonight. Persia does not really allow one. It slips away from final sentences. It survives them. Better to leave it, as the night leaves a distant range of mountains, visible enough to feel, too far to fully possess, still present when the mind begins to drift. Let the last image be simple, stone holding the day's warmth a little longer, cool air moving in from the dark, a road fading beyond sight, water hidden but still travelling, firelight small and steady, and somewhere within all that quiet, the old centre of Persia, not calling for attention, not demanding admiration, simply remaining. You do not need to follow it any farther now. The roads will keep their own memory. The mountains will keep watch, the water will continue under the earth, and the story, like the land itself, will still be there when morning comes, patient as ever, waiting without hurry in the deep and unbroken dark.